What if I told you that one of the greatest military empires in history deliberately rejected a weapon that almost every other civilization considered essential? Imagine standing on a battlefield in the ancient world. Arrows darken the sky. Enemy archers unleash wave after wave of missiles from hundreds of yards away. Most commanders would immediately ask the obvious question: where are our archers? The Romans asked a different question: how quickly can we get close enough to kill them? It sounds insane from a modern perspective. Yet for centuries Rome built the most feared military machine on earth while largely refusing to embrace archery as a core component of its army. Even stranger, this wasn't because the Romans didn't understand bows. They knew exactly what archers could do. They had fought enemies who used them. They had suffered devastating defeats at the hands of skilled bowmen. They had watched entire armies get shredded by arrows. And still, they resisted. At first glance, this story looks like a simple military mistake, but the deeper you dig, the more fascinating it becomes. Because the Roman rejection of archery wasn't really about weapons. It was about identity. It was about culture. It was about what happens when a society becomes so successful that it starts confusing its traditions with universal truths. History is full of civilizations defeated by stronger enemies. Rome's story is more complicated. Many times Rome was defeated by ideas it refused to take seriously, and that's a far more dangerous opponent. Think about it. Human beings rarely reject bad ideas. We usually reject good ideas that threaten our existing beliefs. That's why the Roman attitude toward archery feels surprisingly modern. Every generation has technologies, strategies, or innovations that established institutions dismiss as unnecessary. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're catastrophically wrong. The Romans weren't fools. They conquered vast territories stretching from Britain to the Middle East. They built roads, aqueducts, cities, and administrative systems that shaped Western civilization. Yet some of the smartest people in the ancient world convinced themselves that one of humanity's oldest weapons wasn't worthy of a Roman citizen. The result was centuries of military victories mixed with a growing vulnerability that enemies would eventually learn to exploit. And that's what makes this story so compelling. It's not merely about bows and arrows. It's about how success can become a trap. It's about how organizations become prisoners of their own achievements. Most importantly, it's about a lesson that remains painfully relevant today. The strategies that make you powerful are not always the strategies that keep you powerful. Understand why Rome rejected archery. We first need to understand something even more important. The Romans weren't building an army. They were building a machine. Not a machine made of gears and metal, but a machine made of human beings. Every recruit who entered a legion wasn't simply learning how to fight. He was being transformed into a component of a larger system. Modern movies often portray ancient battles as chaotic masses of screaming warriors swinging weapons wildly at one another. Roman warfare was almost the opposite. It was disciplined, organized, and frighteningly methodical. The individual soldier mattered far less than the formation. A legionary wasn't expected to win heroic duels. He was expected to perform his assigned function with absolute precision. That's why the Roman military invested enormous amounts of time into training. New recruits didn't spend months learning flashy sword techniques. In fact, Roman instructors actively discouraged dramatic swings and theatrical combat. Instead, they focused on repetition. Endless repetition. Over and over again, recruits practiced thrusting with the gladius. The movement was simple, efficient, and deadly. Historians often point out that stabbing wounds were generally more lethal than slashing wounds. A short thrust could penetrate vital organs while exposing the soldier to minimal risk. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinematic. It was brutally practical, and practicality became the foundation of Roman military success. This is where many people misunderstand the genius of the Roman army. Their greatest weapon wasn't the sword. It wasn't the shield. It wasn't even the legion itself. Their greatest weapon was standardization. Every soldier carried similar equipment. Every soldier trained using similar methods. Every soldier understood his role inside the larger formation. Modern military planners still obsess over standardization because it creates predictability. Predictability creates efficiency. Efficiency creates power. The Romans understood this long before anyone could explain it scientifically. Imagine standing in a Roman battle line. To your left and right stand men trained exactly as you were trained. They carry the same shield, the same sword, the same expectations. Everyone knows what happens next. Everyone knows where to stand. Everyone knows how to respond. There is enormous psychological power in that kind of structure. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Roman discipline reduced uncertainty, but this strength contained a hidden weakness. Every successful system develops assumptions. Assumptions become habits. Habits become traditions. Eventually, traditions become sacred. The Roman military machine was designed around one central assumption. Battles are won at close range. Everything flowed from that belief. The shield existed to help soldiers reach the enemy. The sword existed to kill the enemy once contact was made. The formation existed to maintain pressure until the enemy broke. Even the famous Roman mindset reflected this philosophy. Victory wasn't achieved by avoiding danger. Victory was achieved by confronting danger directly and overpowering it. Once you understand that assumption, Rome's hostility toward archery begins to make sense, not because bows were ineffective. They were often devastatingly effective. The problem was that archery challenged the entire logic of the Roman system. It suggested that perhaps the smartest way to win a battle wasn't to get closer. Perhaps it was to stay farther away. And for a civilization built around the opposite belief, that idea felt almost offensive. The Romans didn't merely prefer close combat. They romanticized it. And that distinction matters because people will often change tactics when they discover a better option. They rarely change identity. For a Roman citizen, military service wasn't just a duty. It was a public performance of character. The battlefield served as a stage where courage, discipline, loyalty, and masculinity were displayed before both comrades and history. Roman society even had a word that captured many of these ideals: virtus. The term is difficult to translate perfectly into modern language, but it combined courage, excellence, honor, and manly strength into a single cultural expectation. To possess virtus meant proving yourself under pressure, not talking about bravery, demonstrating it, and crucially, demonstrating it in ways other Romans respected. That's where archery ran into trouble. Think about how humans naturally assign prestige. Certain professions, skills, and achievements become symbols of status. Others become associated with lower ranks regardless of their practical value. A surgeon and a sanitation worker may both save lives, yet society often assigns them very different levels of prestige. Ancient Rome operated according to similar psychological patterns. Close combat occupied the highest level of military prestige. The logic was simple. If you stood face to face with an enemy, accepted the risk of death, and still advanced, you displayed undeniable courage. The closer the danger, the greater the honor, at least according to Roman thinking. Archery disrupted that equation. An archer could kill an opponent from a safe distance. Effective? Absolutely. But to many Romans, it seemed to bypass the very test that made military service meaningful. This wasn't a tactical argument. It was an emotional one. And emotional beliefs are often the hardest to challenge because they become intertwined with self-worth. We see similar patterns throughout history. Knights dismissed early firearms. Traditional generals underestimated tanks. Some business leaders laughed at computers. The resistance rarely begins with evidence. It begins with identity. People protect the things that make them feel important. Roman elites built entire careers around battlefield reputations. Successful military service opened doors to political power. Public speeches often referenced military achievements. Scars became symbols of credibility. Veterans displayed them proudly. Imagine spending decades in a society that constantly celebrates direct combat as the ultimate expression of courage. Then someone arrives and says the future belongs to archers. Even if the evidence supports the claim, accepting it requires surrendering part of your identity. That's an enormous psychological cost. What's fascinating is that the Roman worldview wasn't entirely irrational. Their honor code created extraordinary soldiers. Men held formation under terrifying conditions. Units marched incredible distances. Discipline remained strong even when casualties mounted. Many enemies simply couldn't match Roman resilience. The same cultural values that limited adaptation also produced remarkable strengths. This is what makes history so interesting. Most civilizations aren't destroyed by obvious stupidity. They're constrained by ideas that once made them successful. The Roman emphasis on courage wasn't wrong. The problem emerged when courage became defined too narrowly. Once bravery meant only one thing, alternative methods of warfare became difficult to respect. Meanwhile, beyond Rome's borders, other societies were reaching very different conclusions. They weren't asking how close they could get to the enemy. They were asking how far away they could stay while still winning. And that difference would eventually produce some of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. The Romans didn't merely prefer close combat, they romanticized it. And that distinction matters because people will often change tactics when they discover a better option. They rarely change identity. For a Roman citizen, military service wasn't just a duty. It was a public performance of character. The battlefield served as a stage where courage, discipline, loyalty, and masculinity were displayed before both comrades and history. Roman society even had a word that captured many of these ideals: virtus. The term is difficult to translate perfectly into modern language, but it combined courage, excellence, honor, and manly strength into a single cultural expectation. To possess virtus meant proving yourself under pressure, not talking about bravery, demonstrating it, and crucially, demonstrating it in ways other Romans respected. That's where archery ran into trouble. Think about how humans naturally assign prestige. Certain professions, skills, and achievements become symbols of status. Others become associated with lower ranks regardless of their practical value. A surgeon and a sanitation worker may both save lives, yet society often assigns them very different levels of prestige. Ancient Rome operated according to similar psychological patterns. Close combat occupied the highest level of military prestige. The logic was simple. If you stood face to face with an enemy, accepted the risk of death, and still advanced, you displayed undeniable courage. The closer the danger, the greater the honor, at least according to Roman thinking. Archery disrupted that equation. An archer could kill an opponent from a safe distance. Effective? Absolutely. But to many Romans, it seemed to bypass the very test that made military service meaningful. This wasn't a tactical argument. It was an emotional one. And emotional beliefs are often the hardest to challenge because they become intertwined with self-worth. We see similar patterns throughout history. Knights dismissed early firearms. Traditional generals underestimated tanks. Some business leaders laughed at computers. The resistance rarely begins with evidence. It begins with identity. People protect the things that make them feel important. Roman elites built entire careers around battlefield reputations. Successful military service opened doors to political power. Public speeches often referenced military achievements. Scars became symbols of credibility. Veterans displayed them proudly. Imagine spending decades in a society that constantly celebrates direct combat as the ultimate expression of courage. Then someone arrives and says the future belongs to archers. Even if the evidence supports the claim, accepting it requires surrendering part of your identity. That's an enormous psychological cost. What's fascinating is that the Roman worldview wasn't entirely irrational. Their honor code created extraordinary soldiers. Men held formation under terrifying conditions. Units marched incredible distances. Discipline remained strong even when casualties mounted. Many enemies simply couldn't match Roman resilience. The same cultural values that limited adaptation also produced remarkable strengths. This is what makes history so interesting. Most civilizations aren't destroyed by obvious stupidity. They're constrained by ideas that once made them successful. The Roman emphasis on courage wasn't wrong. The problem emerged when courage became defined too narrowly. Once bravery meant only one thing, Alternative methods of warfare became difficult to respect. Meanwhile, beyond Rome's borders, other societies were reaching very different conclusions. They weren't asking how close they could get to the enemy. They were asking how far away they could stay while still winning. And that difference would eventually produce some of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. One of the most fascinating things about human beings is our ability to protect our beliefs even when reality is punching us directly in the face. The Romans had just witnessed a military catastrophe, thousands of soldiers dead, entire formations rendered helpless, a celebrated commander destroyed. Yet many Roman writers didn't respond by asking, "What can we learn from this?" Instead, they asked, "How can we preserve our worldview?" And that's where the story becomes surprisingly modern. Because every institution faces this temptation. When evidence challenges deeply held assumptions, people often attack the evidence before questioning the assumption. Roman commentators described Parthian tactics as dishonorable. They criticized enemies who refused to stand and fight. They mocked warriors who relied on distance rather than direct confrontation. In other words, they reframed defeat as a moral issue instead of a strategic one. It's an incredibly human reaction. If your identity depends on believing that close combat is the highest form of courage, then admitting that archers can defeat swordsmen creates a painful contradiction. Either the enemy's method works, or your understanding of warfare is incomplete. Most people prefer the first explanation. The Romans were no different. Yet while Roman intellectuals debated honor, Roman generals faced practical realities. Armies still had to win battles. Frontiers still had to be defended. Enemies still kept shooting arrows. And gradually, Rome found itself trapped between ideology and necessity. This tension reveals something important about successful civilizations. They rarely abandon old beliefs all at once. Instead, they develop workarounds. They find ways to solve problems without openly admitting that their original assumptions were wrong. That's exactly what Rome did. Rather than training large numbers of Roman citizen archers, they hired foreigners. At first glance, it seems like a clever compromise. Need archers. Recruit people who already know how to use bows. Simple, efficient, effective, but look deeper and you'll notice something revealing. Rome wasn't rejecting archery because bows didn't work. Rome was rejecting archery because Romans didn't want to be archers. That's a completely different problem. The issue wasn't technology. The issue was identity. This distinction matters because it appears throughout history. Sometimes societies reject innovations because they genuinely believe the innovations are flawed. Other times they reject innovations because adopting them would require changing how they see themselves. Rome had entered the second category. Foreign auxiliaries began filling the gap. Crete supplied famous archers. Syria supplied skilled bowmen. Various frontier peoples brought generations of experience with ranged warfare. These soldiers became increasingly valuable. Yet despite their importance, they occupied an awkward position within the Roman military hierarchy. They helped win battles, but they rarely received the same prestige as citizen legionaries. Imagine being one of these auxiliary archers. Your arrows weaken enemy formations. Your skills provide tactical advantages. Your contribution helps secure victory. Then the triumphal celebrations begin, and most of the glory goes elsewhere. Human organizations often create strange contradictions like this. The people performing essential functions aren't always the people receiving recognition. Rome depended on archers while simultaneously treating archery as culturally inferior. It's a contradiction that would persist for centuries, and like many contradictions, it worked reasonably well until circumstances became more demanding. Because hearing foreign archers solved one problem. It did not solve the deeper challenge lurking beneath the surface. Rome still lacked something its enemies possessed naturally, a culture built around ranged warfare. And that difference would become increasingly important as the ancient world evolved. The Romans had discovered a temporary solution, but temporary solutions have a habit of becoming permanent liabilities. Hearing foreign archers worked as long as Rome remained wealthy, stable, and powerful enough to recruit specialists from across its empire. But every workaround carries a hidden cost. In Rome's case, the cost was dependency. And dependency is dangerous when your enemies are constantly evolving. What makes military history so fascinating is that wars are really competitions in adaptation. Every innovation creates a response. Every advantage inspires a countermeasure. Victory often belongs not to the strongest army, but to the army that learns fastest. Rome had spent centuries perfecting one particular way of fighting. Meanwhile, many of its rivals were perfecting something completely different. Consider the cultures beyond Rome's eastern frontier. For nomadic peoples living on vast grasslands, archery wasn't merely a military skill. It was a way of life. Children learned to ride horses almost as soon as they could walk. Bows were not specialized equipment reserved for soldiers. They were everyday tools woven into the fabric of society. By adulthood, many riders possessed thousands upon thousands of hours of practice. Modern sports scientists often discuss the importance of repetition in developing elite performance. Imagine an athlete training every day from early childhood. Now imagine entire civilizations doing exactly that for generations. That's the advantage Rome faced. You cannot manufacture that kind of expertise overnight. This is where many discussions about military technology become misleading. People often assume that winning weapons can simply be copied. History suggests otherwise. Owning a bow is easy. Creating an archer culture is difficult. A nation can purchase equipment in months. Developing traditions, skills, and institutional knowledge may require centuries. Rome repeatedly encountered this problem. Every time it fought highly skilled mounted archers, it wasn't merely confronting a weapon. It was confronting an entire ecosystem of knowledge. The bow represented the visible part of the system. The invisible part consisted of training methods, social expectations, childhood experiences, and cultural values accumulated over generations. Think of it this way. Giving a violin to someone doesn't make them a musician. Giving a composite bow to a Roman legionary didn't make him a horse archer. Expertise is built slowly, and slow processes are difficult to accelerate. Meanwhile, Roman military culture continued emphasizing different priorities. Legionaries mastered marching. They mastered fortification construction. They mastered formation discipline. They mastered close combat. These were valuable skills. In many situations, they remained superior, but military effectiveness increasingly required flexibility, and flexibility is often hardest for organizations that have enjoyed long periods of success. Successful institutions develop confidence. Confidence becomes certainty. Certainty becomes rigidity. The Romans weren't uniquely stubborn. Human beings behave this way in every era. Businesses ignore disruptive competitors. Governments ignore emerging threats. Experts dismiss unconventional ideas. Sometimes they are correct. Sometimes they discover that yesterday's strengths have become today's weaknesses. The Romans stood at precisely that crossroads. They had built one of history's greatest military systems, yet parts of that system were becoming less suited to a changing world. The challenge wasn't recognizing that archers existed. The challenge was recognizing that the future might belong to armies fundamentally different from the ones that built the Roman Empire. And nowhere would that challenge become more obvious than on the battlefield itself, where logistics, organization, and battlefield reality began exposing cracks in Rome's traditional approach. One of the reasons Rome survived for so long is that its military system was built on logistics. Historians often focus on battles because battles are dramatic, but empires are usually won by supply chains. An army that eats regularly tends to outperform an army that doesn't. Roman commanders understood this better than almost anyone in the ancient world. Their soldiers weren't just fighters. They were builders, engineers, road crews, laborers, and mobile infrastructure specialists. Every legion carried the tools necessary to create order wherever it went, and that was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Yet ironically, it also explains why archery never fit comfortably into the Roman military machine. Every piece of equipment carried by a legionary had been carefully selected for a specific purpose. The shield protected the soldier and supported formation tactics. The sword excelled in close combat. The pilum disrupted enemy lines before contact. Entrenching tools allowed camps to be constructed every night. Food, armor, spare equipment, everything served the larger system. Roman logistics worked because the system was standardized. Standardization reduces complexity. Complexity creates problems. This principle remains true today. Modern militaries spend enormous effort simplifying supply chains because every additional variable creates opportunities for failure. Now imagine trying to integrate large-scale archery into that framework. Suddenly, you need massive quantities of arrows, spare bowstrings, specialized craftsmen, replacement bows, new training programs, new tactical doctrines, new battlefield positions. None of these challenges are impossible, but together they represent something organizations often fear: systemic change. The Romans had spent centuries refining one model. Adopting archery wasn't simply about adding a weapon. It meant altering relationships between training, logistics, tactics, and culture. That's a much larger undertaking. What fascinates me is how often institutions resist change not because the change is ineffective, but because it creates disruption. A better solution isn't always adopted immediately. Sometimes a slightly worse solution survives because it's familiar. Rome repeatedly faced that dilemma. Their existing military structure continued producing victories. Not all victories. Not every victory, but enough victories to justify preserving the status quo, and that's where success becomes dangerous. Failure forces innovation. Success often postpones it. Think about how many companies ignore emerging competitors while profits remain strong. Think about governments ignoring problems until they become crises. Rome was experiencing a military version of the same phenomenon. The system still worked often enough to prevent urgent reform. Yet warning signs kept appearing. Enemies increasingly combined mobility with ranged attacks. Frontier conflicts demanded flexibility. Traditional battlefields became less common. The ancient world was changing. Rome's military machine was adapting slowly, but only because reality kept forcing the issue. There's another lesson hidden here. Organizations rarely change because someone presents a convincing argument. They change because circumstances make the old approach unsustainable. Logic alone rarely defeats tradition. Pressure does. The Romans would eventually discover that truth, because by the 3rd century the empire faced challenges far greater than isolated battlefield defeats. New enemies emerged, borders stretched thinner, recruitment became harder, resources became scarcer. Suddenly old assumptions that once seemed unshakable started looking expensive. And when survival is at stake, even the most stubborn institutions begin reconsidering their principles. The question wasn't whether Rome would change. The question was whether it could change fast enough. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire found itself confronting a problem that has destroyed countless powerful institutions throughout history. The world had changed faster than its traditions. For centuries, Rome's military philosophy had been built around expansion. Conquer territory, absorb resources, recruit manpower, repeat. As long as the empire kept growing, many weaknesses remained hidden beneath success. Expansion acts like a powerful disguise. It allows organizations to postpone difficult conversations because new victories create the illusion that everything is working perfectly. But eventually Rome reached its limits. There were no endless new provinces waiting to be conquered, no limitless supply of wealth flowing inward. Instead, the empire faced a different challenge: defense. Defending an empire requires different skills than building one. Expansion rewards aggression. Defense rewards flexibility. Expansion allows you to choose where to fight. Defense forces you to respond wherever threats emerge. This shift changed everything. Suddenly Rome wasn't dealing with isolated enemies. It faced pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Germanic tribes tested northern frontiers. Persian forces challenged eastern borders. Internal rebellions erupted. Political instability weakened central authority. The military machine that once projected overwhelming power now had to stretch itself across thousands of miles. And under those conditions, old assumptions become expensive. Imagine being a Roman commander responsible for defending a frontier province. You don't care whether archery fits traditional ideals. You care whether your soldiers survive. You don't care what a senator in Rome thinks about military honor. You care about stopping raids, protecting settlements, and keeping supply routes open. Practical necessity has a way of cutting through ideological debates. This is one of the most important patterns in history. Cultural values often dominate during periods of stability. Survival dominates during periods of crisis. The Romans were entering an age of crisis. Gradually, military reforms began appearing. New units emerged. Cavalry became increasingly important. Auxiliary forces expanded. Frontier peoples with specialized military skills entered Roman service in greater numbers. The transformation wasn't sudden. No emperor stood before the army and declared that centuries of tradition had been wrong. Change almost never happens that way. Instead, reality applied pressure year after year until adaptation became unavoidable. What fascinates me is how uncomfortable this process must have felt for traditionalists. Imagine dedicating your entire life to one vision of military excellence. Then watch younger commanders adopt methods your generation once mocked. That's not merely a strategic adjustment. That's a cultural shock. Roman writers from this period often sound frustrated. They complain about declining standards. They lament the loss of old virtues. They criticize changes to military organization. Reading these complaints feels surprisingly familiar. Every generation tends to believe the next generation is abandoning essential principles. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're simply witnessing adaptation. The late Roman army became increasingly diverse, increasingly flexible, and increasingly reliant on skills that earlier Romans had viewed with suspicion. From a military perspective, many of these changes made sense. From a cultural perspective, they were unsettling. And that tension reveals a profound truth about institutions. Survival often requires becoming something your founders would barely recognize. Rome was learning that lesson in real time. The irony was impossible to ignore. The empire that spent centuries celebrating close combat now depended more and more on soldiers trained in methods it once considered inferior. Yet despite all these reforms, one question remained. Had Rome adapted in time? Or had centuries of cultural resistance already imposed costs too great to recover? If you want to understand the rise and fall of great powers, don't just study their victories. Study the moments when they were forced to change, because adaptation reveals truths that success often hides. By the 4th century, Rome's military looked dramatically different from the army that had conquered the Mediterranean world. The transformation wasn't complete and it wasn't uniform, but it was undeniable. Cavalry units occupied a larger role. Archers appeared more frequently. Frontier troops contributed skills that traditional Roman military culture had once dismissed. In practical terms, Rome was finally learning lessons it could have learned centuries earlier. Yet history rarely offers easy rewards for delayed adaptation. This is one of the harshest realities any institution faces. Change eventually becomes more expensive than the innovation that inspired it. Think about a company that ignores technological shifts for decades. Eventually, it must spend enormous resources catching up. Think about governments that postpone infrastructure upgrades until systems begin failing. Delayed adaptation creates accumulated costs. Rome experienced the military version of that phenomenon. For generations, the empire had relied on the extraordinary discipline of its heavy infantry. And to be fair, that discipline achieved astonishing results. Roman legions conquered kingdoms that vastly outnumbered them. They survived disasters that would have destroyed less organized armies. They built an empire stretching across continents. None of that should be minimized. The Roman military remains one of history's greatest achievements, but greatness sometimes creates its own blind spots. When a system succeeds repeatedly, questioning it begins to feel unnecessary. After all, why change something that works? The answer is simple. because your enemies are changing too. And that's where Rome encountered a problem that every dominant power eventually faces. Success freezes assumptions. Competition destroys them. While Roman elites celebrated traditional virtues, rival civilizations continued experimenting. New tactics emerged. New combinations of cavalry and missile troops appeared. Mobility became increasingly important. Battlefield flexibility became increasingly valuable. The ancient world was becoming more dynamic. Yet parts of Roman culture remained anchored to ideas developed centuries earlier. What fascinates me is how recognizable this pattern feels. Modern organizations experience the same struggle constantly. A business develops a winning formula and then becomes emotionally attached to it. A political movement succeeds and begins treating old strategies as sacred. A military wins a war and prepares for the next war as if it will look exactly the same. History repeatedly demonstrates that yesterday's solutions are not guaranteed to solve tomorrow's problems. The Romans eventually understood this. The tragedy is that they often understood it only after paying enormous costs. Thousands of soldiers died in campaigns that exposed weaknesses Rome could have addressed earlier. Resources were spent compensating for limitations that tradition had preserved. Opportunities for innovation were delayed because cultural assumptions discouraged experimentation. Yet perhaps the most interesting lesson isn't that Rome resisted change. Every civilization resists change. The interesting lesson is that Rome adapted it all. Many institutions simply collapse when reality challenges them. Rome survived centuries precisely because it retained some capacity for adjustment. Imperfect adjustment, slow adjustment, sometimes frustratingly slow adjustment, but adjustment nonetheless. The late Roman military became a hybrid force, blending older traditions with newer realities. It wasn't the army of Scipio. It wasn't the army of Caesar. It was something different. And that difference bought the empire time, not permanence, not invincibility, but time. And sometimes time is the most valuable resource any civilization can possess. So what did Rome's hatred of archery actually cost? That's the question that lingers long after the battles end, long after the emperors die, and long after the empire itself begins to fade into history. Because the answer isn't measured only in lost campaigns or battlefield casualties. The real cost was something much harder to calculate. It was the cost of delayed adaptation. The cost of seeing the future arrive and deciding it wasn't respectable enough to acknowledge. History is filled with examples of civilizations losing because they lacked resources, manpower, or technology. Rome's story is more uncomfortable. Rome often had access to the solutions it needed. The empire encountered skilled archers repeatedly. It employed them. It fought alongside them. It watched them dominate battlefields. The evidence was never hidden. The challenge was cultural, and culture is often far more difficult to change than strategy. Looking back, it's tempting to criticize the Romans. We can easily point to defeats and identify mistakes. But before we judge too harshly, it's worth asking a difficult question. What are we refusing to learn from today? Every era has its own version of the Roman archery problem. New technologies emerge. New ideas challenge established systems. Younger generations adopt unfamiliar methods. Experts debate whether change represents progress or decline. Most people assume they would recognize the future if it appeared in front of them. History suggests otherwise. More often, the future arrives disguised as something uncomfortable, inconvenient, or socially unacceptable. The Romans weren't stupid. They were human, and human beings have a remarkable ability to confuse familiarity with correctness. That's the deeper lesson hidden beneath this story. The Roman army succeeded because it mastered discipline, organization, and courage. Those qualities built an empire, but those same strengths created blind spots. Discipline became rigidity, organization became bureaucracy, courage became an unwillingness to reconsider assumptions, success became a prison. This transformation happens everywhere. Businesses become attached to old products, governments become attached to old policies, military institutions become attached to old doctrines. The very characteristics that produce greatness can eventually limit it. That's why adaptability is so rare. Adaptation requires humility. It requires admitting that today's solution may not solve tomorrow's problem. It requires acknowledging that outsiders sometimes possess valuable knowledge. Rome struggled with that lesson. Yet eventually, reality forced the empire to change. By the later centuries, Roman armies increasingly incorporated cavalry, archers, and diverse military traditions from across the empire. Ironically, many of the tactics once dismissed as foreign became essential for survival. The empire adapted, but only after paying a heavy price for resisting adaptation in the first place, and that's the final irony. Rome did not fall because archers existed. Rome did not collapse because bows were superior to swords. Rome's challenge was deeper than any weapon. It was the challenge faced by every successful civilization. How do you remain flexible after success convinces you that you've already found all the answers? Takeaway: the lesson of Rome and the bow is not that tradition is bad or that every innovation deserves acceptance. The lesson is that strength without adaptability eventually becomes weakness. The most dangerous enemy isn't always the army across the battlefield. Sometimes it's the assumption that the way you've always done things is the way things must always be done. Rome conquered much of the known world by mastering one style of warfare. But history's greatest empires are remembered not only for what they mastered, they are remembered for how well they adapted when mastery was no longer enough.